Now, for my sins, I've always been a Paul Keating fan. Sure, I regret voting for him in 1993, but I made up for that 3 years later. But especially as Treasurer, he delivered some landmark reforms for this country. And while I don't always agree with him, he's always worth listening to. Last night on the ABC, he admitted the obvious, that Labor lost the election primarily because it was offering a massive raft of tax increases and nothing by way of income tax cuts. Here he is on 7:30.
You'd fail to understand the middle-class economy that Bob Hawke and I created for Australia. And so much of Labor Party's policies were devoted to the bottom end of the workforce and the community, paid for by cuts in tax expenditures. If the cuts in tax expenditures had have been employed in reducing tax rates, then it would have been a big tax reform and, I believe, a much more successful outcome. But instead of that, the Labor Party was actually increasing the top rate of tax from 45% to 47%, which, of course, you know, in public I opposed.
Now, Keating could have made these points before the election, of course, but we can all understand why he wouldn't pull the rug out from underneath his own team. And who could disagree with his tax analysis now, except, I suppose, some extreme leftists who are in denial over the election result? My point is this: the massive economic and political mistake of Labor's tax plan was obvious to many of us. It was clearly Bill Shorten's main weakness long before the election. Yet most of the political media, in their desperate barracking, ignored this point. They ignored economic and political orthodoxy, and they ignored economic and political history. This was demonstrated just over a week out from the election when Keating and Bob Hawke, just days before his death, issued a letter supporting Labor's economic policy. This was gormlessly reported in the media by journalists who should have known better, as a credible and authoritative endorsement of Shorten's plan. It never made sense. Their letter was more noteworthy for what it didn't say than for the glib tick it gave Labor's economic plan. Now, this is not hindsight from me. You know that I and others on this channel repeatedly warned about the electoral and economic risks of Labor's tax plan. And here's what I wrote at the time, 8 days before the election. Labor rolled out Bob Hawke and Paul Keating to endorse its economic prescription, and they rightly claimed their reforms set up decades of prosperity. But they failed to mention how their own party repudiated this aspirational approach under Kevin Rudd and is now focused not on economic reform, but on increased taxation, redistribution and spending. Privately, Hawke and Keating would be horrified by modern Labor's economic regression, but the media remains conveniently incurious. That assessment now, of course, has been confirmed publicly by none other than Paul Keating. Now, I don't have a relationship with Keating. No one told me what he really thought about Labor's plan, as he revealed last night on the ABC. It was just obvious at the time to anyone who knows recent political history that Hawke and Keating would have been, at the very least, extremely wary about Labor's plan. It never made sense when it comes to the Hawke-Keating legacy on political judgment or economic management. Yet so desperate were most journalists to support their own narrative about an inevitable Shorten victory that they shortchanged their audiences and duped themselves when it came to this crucial economic debate. We've seen yet again how voters are neither as jaundiced nor as naive as the political media class. Just as many of us thought, the voters got it right despite this sort of misinformation. And if you're a Labor supporter, you don't have to believe me, just believe Paul Keating.